meantime, we were just handed some reporting from the New York Times' Peter Baker that says this: John Kelly, Donald Trump's former chief of staff, backs Bolton. And this is a quote from John Kelly. Quote, "If John Bolton says that in the book, I believe John Bolton." I think it's important to keep in mind that what John Bolton also sort of obliterates in his truth-telling in his book is the fissures that have always existed in the Trump West Wing. John Kelly, the former chief of staff, Don McGahn, the former White House counsel, John Bolton, the national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor before him, Dina Powell, H.R. McMaster's deputy before the Bolton time. They have always viewed themselves as protectors of the state, protectors of the country from Donald Trump. They have viewed the other axis pushing against their efforts as Donald Trump, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and in many instances, Ivanka Trump. So to see this axis, this collision, these tectonic plates that have rubbed against each other and caused friction that's burst into the open, usually in the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, to see it burst into open is a reminder that this power struggle has existed since Donald Trump's first days as president, and now in the corner, in the camp of former National Security Advisor John Bolton is a very powerful corroborating witness, and that's former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly. I would say to my friends at Fox News, game on. You're going to have some gladiators coming in behind John Bolton, corroborating his account, and these are note takers, these are memo writers, these are lawyers, these are generals, these are people with masses of credibility.
The attacks on John Bolton have been bracing from the Fox News crowd.
Well, and here's what John Bolton has on his side. The truth. Notes. If you flip open any one of John Bolton's 6 books, the footnotes are almost as long as the chapters. I mean, this is a note taker in the category of, someone like a Comey. I mean, these are people who write contemporaneous memos. And if you remember when the story burst into view about Jared Kushner's inability to obtain a national security clearance, which he never overcame. Donald Trump just gave him one, I guess, so he could achieve Mideast peace. But that story burst into view because the people that had been in receipt of the red flags from the intelligence community were John Kelly, who'd written a memo to file, and former White House counsel Don McGahn. So if people think that John Bolton's story is something they can sort of hash out in a skiff with an unpublished version of a manuscript, they are badly and sorely mistaken. John Bolton had deputies, John Bolton had allies, and John Bolton has the facts and the words that came out of Donald Trump's mouth likely written down and corroborated by multiple human beings.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.